tonight's program, which is entitled Israel, Iran, and the United States Exploring the Strategic Relationship. We're pleased to have with us this evening author of the new book, Treacherous Alliance, I'll hold it up, The Secret Dealings of Israel, Iran, and the United States. Trita Parsi is our guest. The event is sponsored by the World Affairs Council of Northern California and co-sponsored by Stacy's Independent Bookstore, which will be having books here later for those of you who want to buy one and who are interested in having it signed. My name is Marcos Kounalakis. I'm the president and publisher of the Washington Monthly Magazine, and I also host a weekly radio program on the POTUS 08 channel on XM Satellite, which is called Washington Monthly on the Radio. It deals with politics and policy. The World Affairs Council, which I don't run, was established in 1947 to engage the public in the exploration of issues and opportunities that transcend borders. To learn more about the organization and its diverse series of programs, make sure you go to the website, which is itsyourworld.org, or review the flyers that are outside. And if you're not a member of the council, you probably paid more than everybody else to get in here. And if you are not, make sure you join the council. There are also flyers out there that will allow you to join. If you miss a program, you can subscribe to podcasts or find streaming audio online in the audio and video section of your website. That's itsyourworld.org. And you can also hear the World Affairs Council's weekly one-hour radio show, It's Your World, on Monday evenings at 8 p.m. on KQED 88.5 FM. And if none of that works, maybe we'll come to your home and visit you. Before we begin, please take a moment to turn off all the cell phones and PDAs, any other electronic equipment you have, and we'll take this moment to make some announcements about upcoming programs. Next week, the council will host top political analysts Mark Halperin and John Harris. They're the guys who are working at Politico.com. They used to be at the Washington Post. And they'll be the third speakers in the Richard and Judith Guggenheim series. They'll speak in back-to-back events in Silicon Valley and San Francisco, with the first event taking place on Monday, November 12th in San Jose, and the second on Tuesday, November 13th at the Herbst Theater in downtown San Francisco, with both events starting at 6:30. Then on Tuesday, November 27th, the Council is pleased to welcome Michael Levy, Fellow for Science and Technology at the Council on Foreign Relations, and Levy will discuss the risks of nuclear terrorism. One more announcement, and this is going to be a tentative meeting, and I think you'll understand why, because tentatively scheduled on Thursday, December 27th, the Council is planning on welcoming the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Pakistan. Iftikhar Muhammad Chaudhry will either be here or in prison or the President of Pakistan as things are going. So those are all options. If he's here, please join us. I'll now introduce our distinguished guest. Trita Parsi is co-founder and current president of the National Iranian American Council, which is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization promoting Iranian American participation in American civic life. He has served as an advisor to now imprisoned Congressman Bob Ney on Middle East issues, and has worked for the Swedish permanent mission at the UN in New York, where he served in the UN Security Council handling the affairs of Afghanistan, Iraq, and Tajikistan, and Western Sahara. And he served on the General Assembly's Third Committee addressing human rights in Iran, Afghanistan, Myanmar, and Iraq. Dr. Parsi writes regularly on Middle East affairs, and his work has been published in a number of leading newspapers and magazines. He's a frequent commentator on U.S.-Iranian relations and Middle Eastern affairs, and he's on the BBC. You'll see him on PBS NewsHour, CNN, Al Jazeera, and I recently caught him on Democracy Now! With talk of the Iranian nuclear threat heating up, tension between Iran and Israel is dangerously high, and the risk of a war involving the United States looms. According to Dr. Parsi, efforts to diffuse those tensions have failed because the real roots of the hostility between Iran and Israel have eluded Washington policymakers. Here to discuss this strategic three-way relationship, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. Trita Parsi.
Thank you so much, and thank you all for coming today. It's a great pleasure being back here in San Francisco, and great to see that there is such an interest in this topic. It is indeed one of the most important issues that the United States currently is facing. Before I go into the book, I just wanted to tell you a little bit about how come I ended up writing this book and what the background of it was. I started doing my PhD at Johns Hopkins SAIS late August 2001. And the topic that I wanted to write about was Afghanistan. I had dealt with it a little bit in the Security Council. But about 11 days later, 9/11 occurs, and overnight, everyone in Washington suddenly is an Afghan expert. So I felt, well, that market has saturated, so I need to focus on what the next likely conflict in the Middle East is going to be. And Iran and Israel was the obvious answer to me. I'd been working on U.S.-Iran relations for quite some time, and always felt that the Israel factor was a little bit of a 800-pound gorilla. Everyone knew that it was very, very important, but no one could really pin it down and understand why and how, etc., etc. So I thought it would be a great thing to focus on that. And it was an area almost nothing had been written on. The last book that was written on Iran and Israel, directly addressing it, was in 1987 by an Israeli journalist by the name of Samuel Segev. He did a fantastic work. But his book was based solely on his access to Israeli officials as well as Israeli documents. I wanted to see if it would be possible to write something on this very important, secretive relationship by actually taking a look at all sides of the story. So I went to Iran, I went to Israel, and since I'm based in DC, I had access to a lot of American officials as well. Altogether, about 130 interviews with senior officials in all three countries to be able to patch together this very, very fascinating and yet very, at times, depressing relationship that has existed. Before I go into the most depressing parts of it, let me also say a couple of things, that there is a human side to this story. We should never forget that the relationship between the Jewish people and the Iranian people have historically been an absolutely excellent one. Starting all the way back in 539 BC, when Cyrus the Great, the emperor of the Persian state, conquered Babylonia and freed the Jewish population there from the Babylonian captivity. A third of those Jews went and settled in Iran, which was then the world's sole superpower. A third of them stayed in Babylonia and became today's Iraqi Jews. And a third went back to Palestine, Israel, and rebuilt the temple using Persian tax money. And ever since, there's been a very large Jewish community in Iran. Until this day, there are 25,000 Jews still living in Iran, which makes them the largest Jewish community in the Middle East outside of Israel itself. And they have been an integral part of Iranian history, of Iranian culture, and Iran's political development. Many Iranian Jews like to remind their Muslim countrymen that they were actually Iranian Jews about 1,000 years before there ever was an Iranian Muslim. Now, unfortunately, things have changed quite a lot, and I wanted to read a little short section from the book in regards to how this has also put a tremendous amount of strain on the Jewish population of Iranian descent. There are now about 200 or so thousand Jews living in Israel that are of Iranian descent. Some 200,000 Iranian Jews and their descendants live in Israel. Some of them belong to the highest levels of the Israeli political elite. In the Islamic Republic, these individuals would never have been able to excel in their careers. Long before reaching prominence, they would have been stopped by the glass ceiling that separates religious minorities, seculars, and disbelievers from those considered to be capable of being loyal to the Islamic Republic. Current, or actually he's no longer current, Israeli President Moshe Katsav and Deputy Prime Minister Shaul Mofaz were both born in Iran. The recently resigned chief of the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, Dan Khalutz, was born to Persian immigrants to Israel. When Katsav worked at the UN, a favorite pastime of his was to embarrass Iranian diplomats at various events by seeking to converse with them in Persian. Forbidden to talk to Israeli officials, at least in public, the Iranian diplomats could rid themselves of the unrelenting Katsav only by leaving the events. Katsav found this profoundly amusing. Mofaz and Khalutz, however, approach Iran with a bit less humor. They are some of the most hawkish Israeli leaders regarding Iran. when asked in a press conference in January 2005 how far Israel would go to stop Iran's nuclear program, Khalutz, a former pilot, gave a chilling response. 2,000 kilometers. That's the distance between Iran and Israel. Now let's take a step back. Now I'm going to give you a quote. It's a quote from an Israeli prime minister. It is, "Iran is Israel's best friend, and we do not intend to change our position in relation to Tehran." This is said by an Israeli prime minister, but it's not Ben Gurion in the 50s and 60s. It's not Golda Meir in the 70s. It's actually Yitzhak Rabin in 1987. Khomeini was still alive, and he was still calling Israel a cancerous tumor that needed to be removed from the region. I wanted to give you that quote to show the complexity of Israeli-Iranian relations. A complexity that is oftentimes missed out on by focusing too much on the rhetoric, being blinded by the ideology. Certainly today, when President Ahmadinejad is making his most controversial statements about Israel, it's difficult, and one shouldn't, dismiss the rhetoric and the ideology. But the excessive focus on it has caused decision makers to fail to realize the true nature of the conflict that exists between these countries, and by so also being able to fail to find what the most appropriate solution would be. Iran and Israel have, for a long time, after the founding of Israel, actually had positive relations. In the 50s, 60s, and 70s, there were two critical factors that pushed these two countries closer together. These factors were the common threats. Both Iran and Israel feared Soviet penetration of the Middle East, and they sensed a tremendous threat from the Arab world, particularly Pan-Arabism and the nationalist Arab states such as Iraq and Egypt. The common threat caused these two states to have geopolitical imperatives that were in common, and they started to cooperate behind the scenes. The Iranians wanted to keep this as secret as possible, figuring that as long as it was secret, as long as they could keep Israel at a certain distance, they would be able to benefit from the relationship without attracting Arab anger that otherwise would be directed at Israel. So the Iranians built a special tarmac at Tehran airport, far, far away from the central terminal, in which all the Israeli airplanes were to land at night, so that no one would notice how many Israelis were coming to Iran. When Rabin was visiting Iran, he always wore a wig to make sure that no one would be able to recognize him. And the Iranians themselves never flew directly to Israel. They always flew to Turkey, and from Turkey they flew to Israel, and they never had their passport stamped in Israel, so it only looked as if they had visited Turkey. And even though Iran had a mission in Israel, it was labeled Bern 2, Bern, Switzerland. This was the second embassy in Bern, according to Iranian papers. For Israel, obviously, it was important to get this relationship to be as public as possible, because the value of having a Muslim state in the region coming out and having these close relationship with Israel was obviously undeniable to Israel. But it was important to not push too hard and force the Shah to not be able to balance his relationship between Israel and the Arabs. Come 1979, you have a complete shift in the ideology of the Iranian state, going from being a nationalist monarchy, very autocratic, to becoming now a religious, ideological state, at least at the surface. But even though Iran's ideology shifted tremendously, the geopolitical situation did not change that much. Iran was still threatened by the Arab world, and this was no longer a theoretical threat after Saddam Hussein invaded Iran in 1980. The Iranians still feared the Soviet Union. They had done so for 500 years. And in fact, paradoxically, Iran was in even greater need of Israel now, because it had also managed to make an enemy out of the United States through the hostage crisis. Israel continued to fear the Arab bloc, particularly Iraq, now when Egypt had been turned into a friend through the Camp David Accords. And the Soviet Union was a problem for the Israelis because it was the power that was providing the arms to the Arab states that had a negative relationship with Israel. So immediately after the revolution, the Israelis were doing everything they could to make sure that they retain the relationship with Iran in spite of the regime change. The Israelis had successfully done so in Ethiopia, when Ethiopia had a switch and had a change of regime and actually jumped sides in the Cold War. And the Israelis were doing everything they could to be able to do the same thing with Iran. Only 3 days after Saddam invaded Iran, the Israeli Deputy Defense Minister held a press conference in Vienna, an improvised press conference, in which he urged the United States to put the past behind it and help Iran keep up its defenses against Iraq. This was said at a time that 52 American diplomats were still held hostage in Iran. And it was done because for Israel, Iran was still a critical state. It was one of the periphery states that, according to the Israeli security doctrine, Israel needed to have a good relationship. Israel had this doctrine of the periphery that said that in order to maximize Israeli security, you have to make friends with the non-Arab states in the region's periphery in order to have them help you balance the Arab states in Israel's vicinity, the inner and the outer circle. And throughout the 1980s, the Israelis were selling arms to Iran because Iran had an American army, but America refused to sell any of the spare parts to Iran because of the hostage crisis and because of the negative relationship. And Iran could only find those spare parts in 2 places. Vietnam, that had a large number of American weaponry after the war in the 70s, and Israel. And Israel was eagerly using its access to American spare parts in order to be able to rebuild its relationship with the Iranians. And the Iranians recognized that in spite of their ideological objectives, their security imperatives necessitated a relationship with Israel. But the Iranians wanted to have it both ways. The new regime had the aspiration of being a leader in the entire Islamic world. And that necessitated being able to take a very, very strong stance on Palestinian issue and other issues in order to show Iran's Islamic credentials. But at the same time, they were at war with one of the most powerful Arab states, and they needed to be able to make sure that they could survive it. So the Iranian response was increase the rhetoric against Israel while making sure that behind the scenes you continue to work together. And the more the Iranians did not help the Palestinians, in spite of the promises that they had made, that the new government would be helpful to the Palestinians, the more the Palestinians complained that Iran only provided rhetorical support, the more the Iranians increased their rhetoric against Israel in order to cover up that, in essence, in operational policy, they were not doing much to help the Palestinian cause. And this continued throughout the 1980s. I interviewed a senior Iranian official, or strategist rather, who had spent a 3-hour conversation with Ayatollah Khomeini to be able to understand exactly what the policy was that Iran would pursue vis-à-vis the Palestinians. And Khomeini said that the Palestinian issue is primarily a Palestinian issue, and Palestinians should be at the forefront. At the second level, it should involve the Arab states that are bordering Palestine and Israel. And only at the third level, which is only at the rhetorical and ideological level, should Iran be involved. Iran should never become a frontline power against Israel. And the Iranians stuck to this idea throughout the 1980s. And as a result, it was Israel that during the 1980s was lobbying Washington to sell arms to Iran, to open up dialogue with the Iranians, and, perhaps most surprisingly, not pay attention to Iranian rhetoric. Obviously, that's a completely different situation from what we have today. But the real shift comes in 1991-93. Because after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the end of the Cold War, and the defeat of Iraq in the First Persian Gulf War, the 2 factors that had brought Israel and Iran closer together suddenly evaporated. It was no longer a Soviet Union, and it was no longer an powerful Arab state with a standing army that could pose a conventional threat to both Israel and to Iran. And the end of the Cold War improved the security environment both for Iran and for Israel. But it also left both of them unchecked. Just as much as Iran was needed to check Iraq, to a certain extent, Iraq served the purpose of checking Iran. But there was no longer an Iraq that could do so. And many people in Israel started to believe that Iran could potentially now become a real threat to Israel. The end of the Cold War completely reconfigures the geopolitical map of the region. And this provides Israel with a challenge and the Iranians with an opportunity. Iran had, because of its own policies, ended up in significant isolation throughout the 1980s. Very poor relations with the United States. But now, in the early 1990s, Ayatollah Khomeini had passed. The new leadership under Hashemi Rafsanjani wanted to be able to rebuild the relationship with the West because they recognized that the Iranian state, and particularly the revolution, could not survive unless they had access to Western investments and Western technology. They needed to have a better relationship with the US. And in 1989, George Bush Sr., in his inaugural address, says, "Goodwill will beget goodwill," sending Iran a signal that if Iran stretched out a hand and helped the United States would reciprocate. So the Iranians did that. They put pressure on Hezbollah to release all the hostages, American hostages in Lebanon. And come the Persian Gulf War, the Iranians adopted a policy that they called positive neutrality. But in essence, it was a policy in favor of the United States. They communicated with the US behind the scenes. They permitted the United States to use Iranian airspace to attack Iraq. And perhaps most importantly, once the war was over and there was a Shiite uprising in southern Iraq, the Iranians did not put any fuel on the fire. They did not come in to help their Shiite brethren. And that was deeply appreciated by the Bush administration because it evaded a potential civil war in Iraq back in 1991, perhaps similar to what we see today in Iraq. The Iranians were hoping that this aid that they had given to the United States, and in their minds they probably exaggerated their own utility, but that would enable them to come back in from the cold and now be part of the security architecture of the Middle East. And it was a statement by James Baker, the then Secretary of State, that basically was music to the ears of the Iranians. He thanked Iran for the role he had played and said that in the post-Saddam Middle East, there should be a new security architecture and Iran should be included. This was critical to the Iranians. This was a time for them to be able to regain the position that they had back in the 1970s. For Israel, however, the end of the Cold War, the reconfiguration of the geopolitical map was much more of a challenge than an opportunity. Throughout the Persian Gulf War, the United States had assembled an Arab alliance against Iraq within the international alliance. It was critical for the United States to make sure that this was an alliance that had as many Arab states in it as possible to show that this was not a Western war against Iraq. This was the international community, including Arab states, against Iraqi transgression and aggression in Kuwait. So, in order to get the Arabs to join the coalition, the United States needed to keep Israel out. And the Bush administration and Secretary Baker were spending a tremendous amount of diplomatic capital, bringing Syria, Jordan, Egypt into the coalition, and at the same time keeping Israel out. Because if Israel came into the coalition, the Arabs would immediately walk out. And Saddam Hussein fully understood this. And that's part of the reason why he sent 34 Scud missiles into Israel in the hope that Israel would retaliate. And the minute the Israelis would retaliate, the Arabs would walk out of the coalition and the United States' position vis-à-vis Iraq would have been significantly weakened. Israel showed tremendous constraint. Just as much as during the entire 1980s, Israel never reciprocated Iranian rhetoric against Israel and never described Iran as a threat. Yitzhak Shamir took a very, very difficult decision and agreed not to retaliate against Iraq, which for many of the Israelis was very, very tough because Israel's aura of its deterrence was its ability to strike back significantly whenever any Arab country had attacked it. And this time, 34 Scuds, not a single response from the Israelis. But this created, at the same time, tremendous fear in Israel. Because now Israel was in a position that it was kept out of the coalition. The United States was currying favor with the Arab governments. It had given a promise to the Arab governments that if they helped the United States against Iraq, the United States would, after the war, put together a conference and and push for peace between the Israelis and Palestinians and pressure Israel to compromise with the Palestinians. So Israel was fearing, what is Israel's new position going to be in the Middle East if the United States is now improving its relations with the Arab states, is promising them to put pressure on Israel? And at the same time, what would its position be in addition to this if the United States and Iran suddenly also started talking and improving their relationship? There was a fear in Israel that if the United States and Iran were to improve their relationship, it would come at Israeli security interests' expense. And this is the time in which Israel, for the first time since '79, starts to suddenly talk about Iran as a strategic and as a global threat. October 1992, after the Labour government comes into power after a major landslide victory that they had in June of that year. The new Israeli thinking was that the periphery doctrine needs to be inverted. Instead of seeking better relationships with the periphery states, now the strategy was to improve the relations with the Arabs in the vicinity in order to be able to face off a potential threat in the future coming from the periphery. And the periphery was Iran. But it was an exaggerated threat picture, because Yitzhak Rabin recognized that in order to be able to sell to a very skeptical Arab Israeli public that it now needed to make peace with the Palestinians after having growing up for 2 generations seeing them as lethal enemies, now they were suddenly going to be peace partners. There was a need for a looming threat in the horizon that would be able to convince the Israeli public to move towards peace with the Palestinians. And the idea was to increase Israel's significance in Washington by painting out that there was a new threat in the region, and Israel was critical to the United States for offsetting that threat. And according to one Israeli person that I spoke to who was involved in this, there was a feeling in Israel that because of the end of the Cold War, relations with the US were cooling and we needed some new glue for the alliance. And the new glue was radical Islam. And radical Islam was Iran. Now you have a completely different picture. Whereas Israel and Iran were both trying to court the United States, and Israel wanted the US and Iran to open up talks back in the 80s. Only 6 years after Rabin made that quote I mentioned earlier on, you have a situation in which both Iran and Israel are undermining US foreign policy initiatives that they feared would be beneficial to the other. They both felt that they needed to improve their relationship with the United States, and they both felt that it would come at the expense of the other. So the Israelis start creating obstacles for any US-Iran rapprochement, pushing for sanctions and other political obstacles that would make it as difficult as possible for the US and Iran to enter into negotiations, with the fear that if the US and Iran were to talk together, the US and Iran would strike a new relationship, and that relationship could come at the expense of Israel. Iran had a different perspective, but came to similar conclusions. The reasoning in Iran was that through the peace process and Iran's exclusion from regional affairs, the United States was trying to create a new order in the Middle East based on Iran's prolonged isolation. And the weakest link in the American strategy was the peace process. If there could not be a successful peace process, none of the other American objectives or Israeli objectives could be achieved. So now the Iranians started targeting Israel for the first time. Instead of just having rhetoric, now it became operational policy. Now is the time when they start reaching out to rejectionist Palestinian organizations who Iran throughout the 1980s actually had very negative relations with. Iran had very negative relations with the PLO because it was seen as an Arab nationalist movement, very secular. Had very poor relations with Hamas because Hamas was a Sunni fundamentalist organization coming out of the Muslim Brotherhood of Egypt, which was quite anti-Shiite. And perhaps most importantly, both the PLO and Hamas were siding with Iraq throughout the Iraq-Iran war. So in spite of Iran's rhetoric, its relations with the Palestinians was actually quite poor. But now, the Iranians and the Palestinian rejectionist group actually had a common threat. if there had been a successful peace process, Iran would ended up in prolonged state of isolation, and the two-state solution would have made the other Palestinian organizations quite irrelevant. And let me give you a quote from Martin Indyk, who was the Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs in the Clinton administration. A very, very critical person, not only in the peace process, but also in promulgating the policy of dual containment, the idea that in the new Middle East, it would be based on Iran and Iraq's dual exclusion and containment. According to Indyk, the Iranians had every incentive to oppose the peace process. Our strategy was to, on one hand, use the engine of peacemaking to transform the region, and on the other hand, contain the Iranians through sanctions and isolation. The two were symbiotic. The more we succeeded in making peace, the more isolated the Iranians would become. The more we succeeded in containing the Iranians, the more possible it would be to make peace. So they had an incentive to do us in on the peace process in order to defeat our policy of containment and isolation. And therefore, they took aim at the peace process. My interviews with Iranian officials has actually echoed this. One official I spoke to was basically saying that Iran preferred Likud because Likud was not interested in a peace that would seek Iran's exclusion, and as a result was not interested in a scapegoat of turning Iran into the biggest threat in the region in order to be able to bring the Arabs to the Israeli side, as well as convincing the Israeli public to make peace with the Palestinians. And this continues. And then in 1996, there are 4 key terrorist attacks in Israel, killing, I think, more than 79 Israeli civilians. Only a couple of weeks before the elections, Shimon Peres lost those elections with a razor-thin margin to Netanyahu. Netanyahu came into power, and the peace process basically started to die from that moment. Till this day, Peres believes that the Iranians sponsored those 4 attacks for the purpose of turning the Israeli public against the peace process and unelecting him. Whether it's true or not, I've not been able to find out, but certainly the perspective in Iran was that the peace process and the effort to build a new order in the region based on Iran's isolation was a major threat. A couple of years later, though, with Khatami coming to power in Iran, the Iranians started to improve their relationship with European states as well as with many of its Arab neighbors. It's interesting to see Iran's behavior vis-à-vis the Camp David II talks in 2000 compared to what they were doing in 1994. In 1994, the Iranians were heavily supporting many of these organizations. By 2000, the Iranians didn't feel that there was a threat in the same way from a successful peace process, because they had improved their relations with the Arab states and the Europeans to this extent that even if a peace had been achieved between the Palestinians and the Israelis, it would not come at Iran's expense, and it would not lead to Iran's prolonged isolation. There's been numerous cases in which the Iranians and the Israelis have reached out to each other. 1996, Netanyahu, one of the most hawkish leaders in Israel today, were reaching out extensively to Iran because he didn't believe in the peace process, and he felt that it was critical to be able to repatch relationship with Iran. The Iranians were not interested. But the most important outreach, perhaps, came in 2003, in which in May of that year, the Iranians sent over a proposal to the Bush administration to offer broad negotiations between the two countries, basically putting on the table almost every issue that existed between them, with the exception of human rights in Iran. Within the framework of the negotiations, the Iranians offered to have full transparency in their nuclear program, decisive action against any terrorists, above all Al-Qaeda, coordination in Iraq with the United States to ensure that the new government in Iraq would not be a sectarian one. The Iranians had successfully cooperated with the United States and provided very significant help in achieving exactly that goal in Afghanistan only a year and a half earlier. Stop all support for Islamic Jihad and Hamas. Turn Hezbollah into a mere political organization, basically meaning disarming them. And perhaps most importantly, sign on to the Saudi peace plan, the Beirut Declaration, the idea that the Arab world would jointly recognize an Israeli state if Israel recognized the Palestinian state. an acceptance by Iran of the two-state solution. The Iranians had never before offered to have any negotiations in which that would be included and potentially happening. The proposal went to the Bush administration May 3rd, 2003. It got no response. It was only weeks, not days, after the United States had defeated Saddam Hussein and taken Baghdad, and there was a tremendous amount of confidence in the White House. In a sense, perhaps, that whatever the United States could gain by negotiating with Iran, and all of these things that the Iranians had put on the table were basically the aims of US foreign policy for the last 15 years when it came to changing Iranian behavior. But whatever they could achieve, the United States could achieve even more by simply removing the government in Iran. This is back in the time when the word regime change was a very popular term and seen as a very successful policy. What is less known, though, is that the Iranians actually sent their former head of the IRGC a couple of weeks earlier to a conference in Europe sponsored by UCLA and funded by the Pentagon. And this conference takes place a couple of times a year. You have security people and decision makers from all of the region, particularly a very high number of Israelis coming there to discuss various sensitive issues. The Iranians went there not making a proposal to Israel per se, by knowing very well that there was a very large number of Israelis at the conference and they were the key target. And they were presenting the framework of this arrangement that they wanted to find with the US, with the purpose, I strongly believe, to get some Israeli buy-in and assure Israel that if Iran and the United States would make a deal, it would not come at the expense of Israel, because part of that deal would be to change Iranian behavior towards Israel. I've spoken to people who were in the room at the time, including Ze'ev Schiff, one of Israel's most respected military journalists who passed away just a couple of months ago. His sense was that he did not trust the Iranians, and I don't think there's any Israelis you would find that would. But he also said that he had heard this message too many times now to get a sense that this was not just empty talk, this was actually a clear policy. And his assessment was that it was a huge mistake not to pursue it, not to follow it and see where it could lead. Some people would say that this is spilled milk, this is in the past. Perhaps that proposal is not resurrectable. But it's extremely important in my view because it shows that there is a solution to this conflict. This is not a conflict that is ideologically driven. If it was ideologically driven, Iran and Israel would have much poorer relations in the 80s when Iran's ideological zeal was at its top, and would actually have improved their relations in the 1990s when Iran's ideological zeal was plummeting. Instead, it's the other way around. Israel's most harsh rhetoric about Iran came at a time when Iran's zeal and ideological fervor was declining very, very fast. It is the geostrategic shifts that much better explain why there was a shift in the relationship and at what times those shifts came. And this is important because right now, you have people on all three sides of this triangle trying to portray this conflict and the larger conflict in the Middle East as an ideological battle. They're saying that it is 1938 and Iran is Germany. And then they go on to imply that Ahmadinejad is Hitler. If we accept the premises of this analogy, that it is 1938, it is Iran that is Germany, and Ahmadinejad is Hitler, then which decision maker in his or her right mind would like to play the role of Neville Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister who thought he could negotiate with the Germans? This is an analogy that deliberately tries to make the diplomatic option a non-option. Eliminate diplomacy from the table. And when you eliminate diplomacy from the table by portraying this as an ideological battle that has no solution, then you make war inevitable. And we have to ponder upon this very carefully right now because war is not inevitable. Rather than focusing on portraying it as such, we should focus on making peace possible. And it is possible. And I think many of the exchanges that have taken place behind the scenes show that this is a strategic rivalry between these countries. Iran is using the Israel card as part of its toolbox on how to put pressure on the United States. And at the right time, at the right price, they are ready to shift that policy. And Israel, too, is not in an ideological battle with the Iranians, even though it's much easier to get Western support if it is portrayed as an ideological battle between the sole democracy in the Middle East and a tyrannic Islamic dictatorship. I think in the next couple of months, we may end up in a military conflict between these countries. And I think it would be an absolute shame if that were to happen, because I'm absolutely confident that if diplomacy is given a fair chance, it can actually be successful. Because I remember when I saw that proposal in 2003, I was in Congress at the time, I never expected the Iranians to make such an offer. But it went to show that solutions that we cannot conceive of, when we're that far away from the negotiating table, actually may be possible when you're sitting at the table. And if we sit at the table, hopefully, we will be able to see the true nature of this relationship and be able to find a true solution to it as well. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to point out that you have these blue question cards, and if you haven't already filled them out, I'll take a look at some of those. I have a number of them in front of me, and what I've done is I've grouped them into a number of questions that seem to be recurring and fall into categories. But before we get to that, I just wanted to mention one thing, because there's a California connection to the conference that Dr. Parsi just mentioned, this annual or semi-annual conference that takes place in Athens. I actually attended it this last summer, and it is run by the UCLA Ron Burkle Center, and so California is actively involved in at least facilitating some of those back-channel negotiations through our academic institutions, our state institutions. Let me get to the first question, and it really is a very direct question regarding this book that you've just written, and it's how did you gain such unprecedented access to Iranian and Israeli government officials and strategists? It seems you've gotten a fair amount of information that is not available in secondary sources, and you really had to go and talk to these folks.
Thank you for that question and pointing out one of the things that I think is the major strength of the book, actually being able to sit down and talk to them. A lot of people told me, don't do this. This is insane. You can't go to Iran and talk about Israel. You won't come back. It's just simply the way it is. But I decided to give it a shot and framed it as I wanted to talk to them about the Palestinian issue. And from there on, very quickly, go over to discuss Israel much more intimately. And it turned out that it was one of these taboos, one of these holy cows that had taken on a power of its own. People thought that you can't talk about it because no one did. But once you did, it actually turned out that it wasn't that terribly difficult. Now, in Israel, it was, I hate to use this word, but it was actually a cakewalk, because I came there 3 weeks after I was in Iran, and I contacted a lot of people, and I had a tremendous amount of help from some of my professors at Hopkins. But being able to tell people, hey, I just was in Iran 3 weeks ago, and I spoke to a lot of Iranian officials about Israeli-Iranian relations. Do you have time to talk? I hardly had anyone that said no.
One of the issues that is concerning us clearly is the question of nuclear development within Iran, and we've had a couple of questions here, but one of them focuses on the question of a doctrine, a military doctrine, mutual assured destruction. And why would that doctrine not be driving the strategic decisions within the region between Israel and Iran?
Well, actually it is. There's a myth that you can't have mutually assured destruction. Now, obviously it's not necessarily a good situation to end up in. It means that you would have some sort of a nuclear parity in the region. But the argument that has been presented saying that this is not possible is the argument saying you can't have it because the other side is not rational. The other side are a bunch of crazy mullahs and you will never be able to deter them. There's really nothing in history between Iran and Israel, or the United States and Israel, that would actually suggest that the other side is not deterrable. The Israelis have, in many different occasions, been able to deter the Iranians, and so has the United States. If anything, part of the problem, part of the challenge for Israel when it comes to Iran is exactly that it is so rational. It is exactly that it is very calculating, it's following a very Machiavellian policy and presenting to Israel a challenge that is far, far tougher than any of the challenges it's faced in the region before. Now, it's not difficult, though, to end up in a situation in which one would believe that the other side is irrational. And it's partly because the Iranians want to keep it that way. They have a deliberate policy that they call simulated irrationality, wanting the outside world to not fully be able to understand Iran, not be able to figure out Iran. Because the reasoning is, if you're incalculable, then the other side is not going to be able to calculate what your next steps are going to be. And it's going to be more difficult for the outside world to be able to take action against you because they can't figure you out. President Nixon used the same idea. He wanted the Russians to believe that he was a little bit cuckoo because that would make the Russians much more careful in how they dealt with the United States. Nixon.
There we go. What was the name of that policy again?
Well, it was called the Madman policy, I believe.
The Madman policy. I'll use it with my children. There are a number of questions regarding the internal Iranian uprising, and there are comments about how the Iranian on the street is highly westernized in customs. We know they have satellite dishes. They watch Western television. I know that in the past there were pro-U.S. demonstrations in the streets. This is in contrast to the leadership of Ahmadinejad. And the question, combine those internal forces, please, with some of the other questions, which are those of U.S. support for regime change, whether they be for various expatriate groups that look towards Iran to try and foment a type of uprising that would then lead to a change that would be pro-Western and pro-U.S.
It is generally understood that Iran actually does have one of the most the term is a little bit difficult, but what people say is pro-American populations in the Middle East. The average Iranians actually tend to have rather positive views of the United States. They have a positive views of American values, American culture, American people. They tend to have relatives that live here in this country, are part of the 1 million man strong Iranian-American community. And through their relatives, they hear about the tremendous wonders of this country and what a fantastic home the United States has been for their American-Iranian relatives. And they also learn about all the friendships that this community has been able to forge in this country for the last 30, 40 years. That, however, is a tremendous asset that the United States has in the region that I personally believe is not fully appreciating. Because in the rest of the Middle East, there was a poll made, I think, in 2003, 2004, that showed that the population of Indonesia, only about 15%, had a positive view of the United States. That's a strong U.S. ally with the largest Muslim population in the world, largest Muslim country. Same numbers for Pakistan and Turkey, and in Jordan it was a whopping 1%. A country that probably wouldn't be able to fully exist without American support, military support. Iran, however, is quite different. But this is an asset that we can lose as quickly as we have been able to gain it. By the first bomb, by the first bullet, by the first boot on the ground, don't count on that 5 years from now people will say the Iranian street is pro-American. I doubt it very much. But this is an asset that if we use it the right way, could actually lend the way for a much better relationship between the two countries. We wouldn't have the difficulty we have with the other regimes in the Middle East, in which we have great relationship with their leaders, unelected leaders usually, because they're all dictatorships, and absolutely poor relations with their streets.
We have a number of questions regarding American domestic politics and our views on foreign policy, again, particularly regarding Iran, and not so much on the Israeli question here. But I'm going to combine these two questions. The first is a very simple one, and is it true that Vice President Cheney was mostly responsible for rejecting the Iran proposal in 2003?
I've interviewed several people in the administration, and everyone points their finger in that direction. In the Vice President's office, as well as Secretary Rumsfeld, that had a completely different vision. The vision was, after Iraq, you do take out the other countries that are problematic for the United States. You install governments that are much, much more friendly. You make these countries much more dependent. And net effect for the United States would have been much, much better than to get these significant shifts in Iranian foreign policy. Shifts that the United States for about 12 years at the time had urged the Iranians to do as a precondition for being able to have a better relationship.
I think in the book you referred to that as imperial hubris at the time.
Well, it was definitely hubris in the sense that, much like in 1991, after the United States defeated Iraq and was at the apex of its diplomatic and military power, was the sole superpower, the New World Order, they put together the Madrid Conference, and they did not invite the Iranians. And believe it or not, Tehran was deeply offended by that. Not because they necessarily thought that they would be able to have the solution to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, but because the second track of Madrid was to talk about regional security. And Iran is very much part of a regional region, and it felt that because it had been helpful in Iraq, it would now be thanked by being brought into that conference. I've spoken to a lot of people in the previous Bush administration, asking them why did that not happen. And the basic answer was, well, we really didn't think we needed them because we were on top of our game. Everything was going our way. Who cared about Iran? And it was a similar situation in 2003. It had taken the United States 3 weeks to defeat Iraq, and it had taken the Iranians 8 years to reach a stalemate. There was a feeling that the United States could go forward without anyone else in the world.
Well, today in San Francisco it is an election day, and the mayor is certainly watching the returns, but we are also going to be entering a presidential election year next year in 2008. And the question of wedge issues in domestic politics, Senator Clinton was recently criticized for voting the Iranian Revolutionary Guard as international terrorists, and Senator Edwards says that this is really preparing the road for a second Iraq war. How do you see the domestic political election, the presidential election, shaping the tensions currently between the U.S. and Iran?
Both in the United States and certainly in Iran, both countries, at least their leadership, live in a paradigm of enmity when it comes to each other. We're constantly viewing each other through that lens. It's a zero-sum game. And I think the election debates, to a very large extent, reflect that as well. When we're talking about using military strikes against Iran, it is to punish Iran. When we talk about using sanctions, it's to punish Iran. Even when we talk about diplomacy, we're going to talk to them to punish them. Every measure we're using, regardless of what the measure is, the end goal seems to be punishment and beating them back. That mentality, I believe, absolutely needs to shift in order to be able to find a mutually usable and beneficial relationship, in which we would definitely have to get tremendous amount of changes in Iranian foreign policy behavior. So even if there is a shift in the administration, if this paradigm continues to exist, then I fear that the two countries will continue to gravitate towards a conflict, particularly as they are now getting deeper and deeper into each other's spheres of influence.
So the question that every academic looks forward to is the presidency is chosen, and we either have, say, a President Romney or a President Clinton, and they call you up and they say, what do we need to do about this conflict? How do we solve this Iranian
I think the
tension?
fundamental thing that we have to recognize, not just with Iran, but with most countries, is that the propensity for Iran to support instability or act as spoiler is far greater when Iran is excluded. When it is included, however, into a regional framework, then it has the incentives to be able to shift its behavior. Many of the instances in which secret messages have been passed between Iran and the United States have shown that Iran is capable of doing so, particularly in Afghanistan. The Iranians gave the United States tremendous amount of help after 9/11 because they had been funding and arming the Northern Alliance for more than 10 years, at the time when the United States actually was turning a blind eye to what the Taliban was doing. And it showed that when the United States or Iran, neither of them are trying to exclude the other from the process, they could actually work well together and get very, very positive results. In the Middle East right now, we are constantly pursuing orders based on one or two very powerful countries. That gives those countries the incentives to undermine everything we do because they're not going to accept exclusion. I think the United States actually have an ace up its sleeve. The Iranians want a seat at the table. They want a very prominent seat at the table. They can make it costly for the United States to pursue a policy of exclusion, but they can never gain that seat without some sort of American acceptance and buy-in. That's the carrot that we've so far never been willing to use. And if we can use it, and through that demand significant changes in Iranian foreign policy behavior, including changes towards Iran's position on Israel, then I think we will not only be able to find a better relationship with Iran, we will be able to find a better paradigm for the entire region to be in, instead of the current balance of power paradigm that ends up causing a war in the region every 10 years.
I think Senator Obama has recently talked about some of these carrots as well. Is that something that you sign on to?
I believe that there needs to be negotiations. I believe there needs to definitely be carrots and sticks. But I believe that any limited approach that is just aimed to make some sort of a tactical deal between the United States and Iran without translating that tactical deal into larger strategic shift is going to be unsustainable, it's going to fail, and it's going to make it even more difficult the second time around to be able to find a sustainable solution.
Okay, well, I think you would find me remiss if I were not to ask the question of the day, since Pakistan is in the news daily, and they seem to be quite close to Iran. How does the recent development in Pakistan with Musharraf impact, if at all, the future divisions of the U.S. and Israel against Iran?
That was a question I hoped you wouldn't ask. I can only speculate. I definitely do believe that the Iranians are extremely concerned, because if Musharraf leaves, or if there's some sort of instability there, and this is a country that has nuclear weapons, it is a country that for 10 years its Secret Service was funding and arming and building the Taliban. It's very, very dangerous for Iran and for the rest of the region. But let me add one thing to the previous question that you asked. I think from Israel's perspective, it has now pursued a policy for quite some time trying to seek Iran's isolation and exclusion. It's not really worked out that well, because Iran is more powerful today than 12 years ago when those policies were put in place. I think Israel's security is best achieved not outside and absent a U.S.-Iran deal, but actually within the context of a U.S.-Iran deal, in which Israel, as a friend of the United States, can use its influence here and its friendship to be able to make sure that the deal that is made is not coming at the expense of Israel's security.
And the strength of Iran is based on the price of oil and our failure in Iraq?
Perhaps more the second than the first. But the Iranians actually have had a positive power trajectory for the last 15 years. Their rise in power have certainly been accentuated because of the United States taking out the Taliban, which were enemies of Iran, and then defeating Saddam and messing it up so badly that the Iranians had such an easy time to be able to go in there and build much stronger networks, have much better relationship with many of the political figures there, and are most likely going to be on the winning side whoever wins an election in Iraq. Because they've invested in every faction almost in the Iraqi political scale.
And I think it's important to always recall that when we talk about the defeat of the Taliban in Afghanistan, the role, the very active role that Iran played with the United States in achieving that. Another actual issue, we've had in the last couple days a visit from the Turkish Prime Minister to the United States, and so the question of Kurdistan and the Kurds arises. And one of the questioners here asks, about a year ago I read in a national magazine that Israel supported financial, material, etc., the Kurdish Peshmerga. I only saw this allegation in one source. Do you have any knowledge of Israeli assistance to the Kurds?
Israeli assistance to the Kurds is actually not just Israeli, it's an Israeli-Iranian triangle that started in 1965 when the Israelis started supporting the Barzani clan in northern Iraq with the aim of destabilizing Iraq and making Saddam Hussein, and who was not the strongman at the time, but Iraq focused more on its internal problems so it wouldn't be able to pose a threat to Israel or to Iran. They approached the Iranians originally were very skeptical. They didn't like Barzani. They thought he was a communist. But more importantly, the Israelis would not have minded if the Kurds actually were successful and they managed to break out of Iraq and create another non-Arab state in the region that would significantly weaken Iraq. The Iranians did not want to see that scenario at all, mindful of their own Kurdish population, so they were much more of two-hearted about it. This continued, however, to 1975, in which the Shah met Saddam Hussein in Algiers, and over a span of 2.5 days, they negotiated a deal on a border dispute that they had in the waterway of Arvandrud, Shat al-Arab. And overnight, the Iranians shut the corridor that the Israelis had access to the Kurds. The Israelis were infuriated. They were not told about this. They had 2 hours to get their men out, all of them Mossad people, back into Iran. I have a quote from one of them in the book who said, I was cursing Iran all the way back to Tehran. This was a cooperation that Iran and the United States and Israel had had for more than a decade, supporting the Barzani clan to weaken Iraq. The Israelis never gave up on the idea of being able to reach out to the Kurds. The fact that they're now, after the fall of Saddam, investing in Kurdistan is, I think, by now no longer a secret. I've spoken to several journalists who have been seeing this up front. This has been reported by the BBC and many others. And it makes perfect sense, mindful of Israel's security outlook. Whenever they had an opportunity to help a non-ethnic minority in a country be able to gain power and influence, they've always sought to explore those opportunities.
You know, I'm going to throw in my own blue card here and say that I was recently at the Hoover Institution on a media fellowship, and one of the academics there has access to the White House, and said in a recent meeting with the president that the president concluded the meeting by saying, "I will not leave office a nuclear-capable Iran." You spend a lot of time in Washington, D.C. Is it your sense that this administration has a Jones to go to war with Iran?
Well, there certainly doesn't seem like they don't, mindful of everything that is happening. And that's something we have to keep in mind. A lot of the things that are happening, one can interpret it in different ways, but there's very few things that are happening that one can clear-cut say, well, this really shows that they're not looking for a military conflict. And problem with the nuclear issue is that we put the bar so low. We're not talking about Iran having a nuclear weapon. We're talking about Iran having a nuclear capability, which is then defined as having control over the fuel cycle and have roughly 3,000 centrifuges. Well, the Iranians already have that. And if you want to reverse that, it doesn't mean that you just take out all the known and unknown facilities that Iran has, which the United States perhaps can do, Israel cannot. It would actually mean you would have to kill 6,000 Iranian nuclear scientists. And I don't know if any administration would be able to sell that to the American people. We need to redefine how we view the nuclear issue. We can definitely prevent Iran from having a nuclear weapon, while at the same time the Iranians have a very small nuclear enrichment program. That is possible. And the IAEA has several times said that through inspections, etc., that is achievable. But we've set the bar so low that it's very difficult to see how you can do anything without going to war.
Another question, and I'll do one more, and then I'll let you move on to signing books and maybe greeting some of our guests. The United States has a fairly large Iranian-American population. We often refer to sections of Los Angeles as Tehrangeles. And what effect does this diaspora have on our foreign policy towards Iran?
Well, for the last 20 or so years, very little. Because the Iranian-American community came here, they're very well educated, they've made fantastic lives here. America has been extremely generous to them. But they're also a community that, because of their own history in Iran and because of the hostage crisis, have done tremendous amount of effort to stay out of politics. So their influence on the political process, at least up until 2001, was very, very little. After 9/11, however, there was a recognition that this is not a winning strategy. 19 terrorists fly into the Twin Towers. None of them are Iranian or any connection to Iran, yet the visa laws that are affecting Iranian Americans' ability to visit with their family members was the first law that was passed in Congress. And people started to realize, okay, we need to have a political voice. The organization that I represent is now the largest grassroots organization. And it is seeking to be able to bring the natural expertise that the Iranian Americans have about that region, about that country, an expertise that is so critical for the United States in these difficult times. to the policy process, while at the same time making sure that this community participates in the democracy much more than it has done so far, because democracy is an absolutely wonderful thing and it should not be wasted. They didn't have it in the country that they came from. They have it here, and they should not waste it while they're here.
I think that's a marvelous note on which to end.
Thank you.
Of your website, that's itsyourworld.org. And you can also hear the World Affairs Council's weekly one-hour radio show, It's Your World, on Monday evenings at 8 p.m. on KQED 88.5 FM. And if none of that works, maybe we'll come to your home and visit you. Before we begin, please take a moment to turn off all the cell phones and PDAs, any other electronic equipment you have, and we'll take this moment to make some announcements about upcoming programs. Next week, the Council will host top political analysts Mark Halperin and John Harris. They're the guys who are working at Politico.com. They used to be at the Washington Post. And they'll be the third speakers in the Richard and Judith Guggenheim series. They'll speak in back-to-back events in Silicon Valley and San Francisco, with the first event taking place on Monday, November 12th in San Jose, and the second on Tuesday, November 13th at the Herbst Theater in downtown San Francisco, with both events starting at 6:30. Then on Tuesday, November 27th, the Council is pleased to welcome Michael Levy, Fellow for Science and Technology at the Council on Foreign Relations, and Levy will discuss the risks of nuclear terrorism. One more announcement, and this is going to be a tentative meeting, and I think you'll understand why, because tentatively scheduled on Thursday. With talk of the Iranian nuclear threat heating up, tension between Iran and Israel is dangerously high, and the risk of a war involving the United States looms. According to Dr. Parsi, efforts to diffuse those tensions have failed because the real roots of the hostility between Iran and Israel have eluded Washington policymakers. Here to discuss the strategic three-way relationship, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. Triti Parsi.
Thank you so much, and thank you all for coming today. It's a great pleasure being back here in San Francisco, and great to see that there is such an interest in this topic. It is indeed one of the most important issues that the United States currently is facing. Before I go into the book, I just wanted to tell you a little bit about how come I ended up writing this book and what the background of it was. I started doing my PhD at Johns Hopkins SAIS late August 2001. And the topic that I wanted to write about was Afghanistan. I had dealt with it a little bit in the Security Council. But about 11 days later, 9/11 occurs, and overnight, everyone in Washington suddenly is an Afghan expert. So I felt, well, that market has saturated, so I need to focus on what the next likely conflict in the Middle East is going to be. And
December 27th, the Council is planning on welcoming the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Pakistan. Iftikhar Muhammad Chaudhry will either be here or in prison or the President of Pakistan as things are going. So those are all options. If he's here, please join us. I'll now introduce our distinguished guest. Trita Parsi is co-founder and current president of the National Iranian American Council, which is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization promoting Iranian-American participation in American civic life. He has served as an advisor to now imprisoned Congressman Bob Ney on Middle East issues, and has worked for the Swedish permanent mission at the UN in New York, where he served in the UN Security Council handling the affairs of Afghanistan, Iraq, and Tajikistan, and Western Sahara. And he served on the General Assembly's Third Committee addressing human rights in Iran, Afghanistan, Myanmar, and Iraq. Dr. Parsi writes regularly on Middle East affairs, and his work has been published in a number of leading newspapers and magazines. He's a frequent commentator on U.S.-Iranian relations and Middle Eastern affairs, and he's on the BBC. You'll see him on PBS NewsHour, CNN, Al Jazeera, and I recently caught him on Democracy Now! This program, which is entitled Israel, Iran, and the United States, Exploring the Strategic Relationship. We're pleased to have with us this evening author of the new book, Treacherous Alliance, I'll hold it up, The Secret Dealings of Israel, Iran, and the United States. Trita Parsi is our guest. The event is sponsored by the World Affairs Council of Northern California and co-sponsored by Stacy's Independent Bookstore, which will be having books here later for those of you who want to buy one and who are interested in having it signed. My name is Marcos Kounalakis. I'm the president and publisher of the Washington Monthly Magazine, and I also host a weekly radio program on the POTUS 08 channel on XM satellite, which is called Washington Monthly on the Radio. It deals with politics and policy. The World Affairs Council, which I don't run, was established in 1947 to engage the public in the exploration of issues and opportunities that transcend borders. To learn more about the organization and its diverse series of programs, make sure you go to the website, which is itsyourworld.org, or review the flyers that are outside. And if you're not a member of the council, you probably paid more than everybody else to get in here. And if you are not, make sure you join the council. There are also flyers out there that will allow you to join. If you miss a program, you can subscribe to podcasts or find streaming audio online in the audio and video section.
Iran and Israel was the obvious answer to me. I'd been working on U.S.-Iran relations for quite some time, and always felt that the Israel factor was a little bit of a 800-pound gorilla. Everyone knew that it was very, very important, but no one could really pin it down and understand why and how, etc., etc. So I thought it would be a great thing to focus on that. And it was an area almost nothing had been written on. The last book that was written on Iran and Israel, directly addressing it, was in 1987 by an Israeli journalist by the name of Samuel Segev. He did a fantastic work. But his book was based solely on his access to Israeli officials as well as Israeli documents. I wanted to see if it would be possible to write something on this very important, secretive relationship by actually taking a look at all sides of the story. So I went to Iran, I went to Israel, and since I'm based in DC, I had access to a lot of American officials as well. Altogether, about 130 interviews with senior officials in all three countries to be able to patch together this very, very fascinating and yet very, at times, depressing relationship that has existed. Before I go into the most depressing parts of it, let me also say a couple of things, that there is a human side to this story. We should never forget that the relationship between the Jewish people and the Iranian people